Thanks for tuning into my new show, Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People. I'm Steve Raye, author of the book, How to Get U.S. Market Ready. And in my previous podcast, I shared some of the lessons I've learned from 30 years in the wine and spirits business, helping brands enter and grow in the U.S. market. This series will be dedicated to the personalities who have been working in the Italian wine sector in the U.S., their experiences, challenges, and personal stories. I'll uncover the roads that they walked, shedding light on current trends, business strategies, and their unique brands. So, thanks for listening in, and let's get to the interview. Hi, this is Steve Raye, and welcome to this week's edition of Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People. This week, I'm really pleased to have as a guest Alder Yarrow, who's one of the oldsters in the blogging industry. Alder, I can't say he practically invented the concept of a blog, but he was one of the first and longest lasting wine bloggers in the industry. So instead of me going on about how wonderful you are, Alder, why don't you give us a short background of what you do, that you have a life outside of wine in the real world?
Sure. Well, in some ways, that life outside of wine was responsible for the wine blog itself. I got into internet design very early on in the early 90s while I was still in college and while getting a photography degree and a documentary film studies degree. And I sort of had this choice when I graduated, did I want to continue being a starving student and go get an MFA or something like that in photography or cinematography, or did I want to go out and actually earn some money? And the internet boom was just starting in 96 when I graduated. And so I thought, well, I'm sort of tired of being a starving student. I'm going to go out and get a real job. And so I went and helped a guy start a web design agency. And that was really the beginning of a long career in doing digital design, digital marketing, experience design. And I eventually ended up specializing in user experience and starting my own agency, which I ran for 17 years or so up until quite recently. And so in the early 2000s, I had clients coming to me and saying, hey, we hear about these things called blogs, should we have one? And I didn't really know much about them. I knew they were a kind of website. And, at that point, everybody had heard of the Drudge Report, which was making big news in the space of, politics and independent publishing. And so I thought, oh, geez, I better figure this out so I can answer these questions that clients are asking me. And so I thought, well, the best way to do that is to start a blog myself. What kind of blog should I start? And I only had to think for about 2 seconds before I knew that I needed to start a wine blog, because for the previous 10 years, I had sort of gradually slipped, fallen, dove deep into the pit of becoming a serious wine geek after tasting some wines while I was in college and realizing, wow, these are really cool. These are really interesting. They all taste different. I wonder why. I don't know why. And not being a beer drinker, that ended up being my tipple of choice as a college student and then after college. So, I had the skills required to figure out what blogs were all about. I had clients asking me, and then I had this passion for wine that, was just sort of being exercised in buying bottles, to drink with dinner up until that point and reading as much as I could about it. So that was the genesis of Vinography. January of 2004, set up a blog in movable type and sort of started. After about 3 weeks, I found myself writing almost every day about wine, and you could sort of say I haven't quit for 17 years.
Yeah. So first question I have is also being a writer and doing a blog on the side. I'm not as prolific or productive as you are on the blog. Is how do you keep up the discipline of writing every day? And publishing every day. I'm sorry, writing every day is easy. Publishing every day is not, because that means you have to polish.
It's incredibly hard. And I think there are several answers to that question. I think one has to do with that word polish that you just used, which is that in some ways you have to train yourself to be okay with it not being polished. I think one of the things that really prevent people from publishing regularly is this idea of like, they have to get it right. They have to get it perfect. And I think the blog medium, certainly in its most professional forms, run by corporations that have paid employees who blog, certainly there's a standard of perfection that they need to get to, because, they have big name advertisers and sometimes people paying for that content, and nobody wants to see a spelling mistake or a slightly run-on sentence or whatever. But as an individual private citizen blogger who's just putting your thoughts out on the internet for free, I think one of the largest barriers to productivity is that perfectionism. And so one of the things I had to do early on was train myself to just do it, just get it out there. The famous writer, novelist, and writing coach Annie Lamott has the concept of shitty first drafts. And in blogging world, I think really what we're talking about is shitty final drafts in a lot of ways. But so that's a big barrier for a lot of people. And then it is a discipline. You use the right word. It is just like, getting out and going for a run every day, if that's one of your disciplines, which is a particularly tough one for me, I have to say. You just have to do it. You have to sort of steel yourself and develop the habits, however your body and brain develop habits to do it. And in my case, it really helps that I don't watch television. And so there aren't a lot of other media things competing for my attention other than, my family, my daughter, my dog and all the, normal aspects of life. But, in the evenings when a lot of people would just plop themselves down in front of the TV and watch 2 hours of media, I don't have that habit. And so it's pretty natural for me to sit down and say, what do I want to write about? Or what do I want to read about in the world of wine?
Okay, I'm reminded I had a partner whose philosophy was done is better than perfect, and my response is good enough isn't. And that I think kind of capsulizes what you just said, why I don't do what you do.
Well, there's a tension between those things that everybody has to negotiate for themselves, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's similar to the idea. I get asked a lot about, I've always worked in a home office, except for about 10 years when I owned a larger agency. And question is not how do you get yourself to do it, is how do you get yourself to stop? Because you go down first thing in the morning with a cup of coffee and the next thing you know, it's lunchtime and the dogs haven't been walked and you got to go back to work.
And you haven't showered and you're still in your pajamas. I get it.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go there, but yeah, okay. All right, so 17 years, long time. What was in it for you 17 years ago and what's in it for you now? What is the motivation or the reward you get back? Certainly not money. I remember asking you about maybe 15 years ago, how do you monetize that? And you laughed and said you didn't. The net total that you might have earned was not much.
Yeah, it's pretty tough.
So that's the question. What's in it today and what was in it before?
Yeah, certainly it is no more, sort of revenue generating than it was back then, really, other than the degree to which, my success as a blogger, if you can call it that, has been parlayed into paid writing gig elsewhere, with Jancis, starting to work with Jancis as a columnist, getting asked by various magazines to write articles, etc. So, that has generated some income, but it's a laughable amount of income, as most wine writers would tell you. What is in it for me is what has always been in it for me, which is a creative outlet that exercises a passion of. I love wine. I love drinking it. I love tasting it. I love learning about it. I love writing about it. And, people always snigger when I say, some people knit, I write about wine, but it's quite an apt analogy, right? When I want to do something creative just for myself, relaxing, I write about wine. And other people, sit down on the couch with their knitting needles and they knit. And, unlike knitting, I can't write about wine and watch television at the same time or have a conversation with somebody at the same time. So it's not a perfect analogy. It definitely is a sort of a personal creative pursuit that brings me great fulfillment and joy. I think one of the reasons I continue to do it, though, is outside of that now or beyond that now, which is that I have built up an audience, I have built up a following, and those people have a set of expectations on me that I try not to internalize too much or use to put too much pressure on myself. But there's definitely an awareness that people want to hear what I have to say next. People want to know, every week which articles I think are worth reading about wine on the internet. People want to hear what I have to say about the latest vintage from Napa Valley or whatever. And so there's that external expectation that also is a motivating factor for me to keep writing. And I love it. I like, putting stuff out there and having people say, oh my God, I tried that wine. It was amazing.
You were talking about the reasons why you do this. I think one of the things that separates vinography, which I don't know if I introduced it, but that's the name of Alder's blog, from many, if not most, if not all, other blogs, is you're very opinionated. I don't agree with you probably half the time. It's fine. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. But you express that information well and put it in perspective. And one example of that, I think, is a recent post you did on the history of blogging. You look back and said, okay, here's my blog roll from 17 years ago, a list of all the other bloggers people might be interested in listening. You still have a blog roll, which is kind of archaic, but it's cool. I'm not on it, by the way, just saying. Okay. But there are a bunch of people, call them the old guard, guys like Joe Roberts. And of course, my mind just went blank, but you're still there and doing it. You made some comments on how blogging has evolved. You want to just comment on that post that you had done?
Sure. And there are plenty of people that have, said, well, wait a minute, blogging's not dead. And, I definitely think that is one way to interpret that blog post. I didn't mean to say it quite that way, but, the fact of the matter is for a long time, I was tracking hundreds and hundreds of blogs on the internet. And when I went back recently and pruned that list and literally clicked on every link to see which ones were still there and still active, my number of people blogging in the English language dropped from, 600 down to about 114 people who had put up a post in the last 6 months, even. That was sort of the loose criteria for quote unquote still active. And so, and in some of those cases, people had put up one or two. And so that was a huge drop, right? And as I analyzed, when most of these people stopped publishing, it looked like 2012, 2013 was sort of the peak. A lot of these bloggers just stopped writing at that point. And certainly many of them have transitioned to other media, right? So, that was, the rise of Twitter, the rise of Instagram around that time. And many people have transitioned to those platforms as a way of communicating about wine. And a lot of people are sort of, I think, over reading into the piece that, wine communication is dead. And, they're saying, well, what about the Instagrammers? What about the tweeters? And absolutely, that's true. There are plenty of, back, when I started, there wasn't Twitter, there wasn't Instagram. And so, blogging was the only channel for sort of that self-publication, wine communication. And so it definitely was shocking to me how many of those hundreds of blogs sort of had been abandoned. And that was the primary thrust of my piece. And I will admit there was a certain amount of sadness to see that sort of groundswell of sort of purely community-based communication and discussion about wine going away. But it hasn't gone away entirely, as some of the critics of that piece have pointed out. It has shifted and morphed, and that's absolutely 100% true. But I do miss the days when there were hundreds of people, writing articles about wine for free on the internet. And it's too bad some of those folks who were very talented didn't continue that work.
Yeah, I think the big challenge for everybody who's trying to make a living as a writer in the wine industry is you're probably not. I mean, it's just there's not enough outlets for it, nor outlets that pay sufficient for it. Speaking of which, though, let's talk about Jancis. My understanding of how this all came about is you were writing. Jancis was pretty impressed with what you were doing, and she reached out and called you and said, I'd like you to work with me and contribute to the Purple Pages. We're talking about Jancis Robinson now, the author and wine writer.
Yeah, we were both actually, this happened in person. We both found ourselves at the International Pinot Noir celebration in McMinnville in Oregon. And we ended up saying hello and seated at the same table at one point. And she, said, hey, Alder, you're doing great work. I'd like to find a way to collaborate. And that was the beginning of a conversation. And we continued it, after the event via email. And eventually we settled on me doing a monthly column for her, which I've been doing now for a little over 10 years.
Yeah, it's almost, to use the British metaphor, that you got knighted. So you're one of the more significant people, because I was going to use the word legitimate, not that you have a legitimate, but you have a revenue generated model that you are writing for. And I think that's kind of the goal for a lot of people who are writing in this.
Yes, Jancis will tell you that it doesn't generate a lot of revenue, and I, as a writer, don't get paid a lot to write there. But yeah, no, I am now writing for the most trusted wine critic in Europe, if surveys are any indication, and the largest sort of wine trafficked red wine publication in Europe online.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Italian wine. I would point out that when I first started talking with Alder, we ended up going on 2 trips within a couple of years, once to Santorini and another one to Austria. What interests you today in the world of wine, and how have you evolved in what your interests are?
What interests me about wine today is still the thing that interested me about wine when I first got into it, which is just the sheer variety of experiences that wine can convey. And I mean that in every sense of the word experience, in that wine is food, wine is culture, wine is geography, wine is geology, right? There's so much in every glass, in every wine, and every story behind it. It's a very rich domain of knowledge and of experience. But there's a more primal variety that one experiences, especially when you're first getting into wine, which is just, good God, there are so many flavors and aromas, and there are so many different types of wine, and that variety is endlessly fascinating and sustaining and satisfying for me. In part, that is one of the reasons why, and I know this may sound slightly slavish to say on the Italian Wine podcast here, but, people are constantly asking me as a wine writer and wine critic, well, what's your favorite wine? Which is a ridiculous and impossible question to answer. But my typical answer is, well, that's pretty difficult. That's like asking a film critic, what's the best film ever? It's not something you can say. But what I can say is that if I had to drink the wines of one country for the rest of my life, it would be Italy without a question. And one of the reasons for that, for me, is just the incredible variety of grapes and types of wine that Italy grows. And as a wine lover in the beginning of my journey in wine, and as a wine lover now, life is too short to keep drinking the 7 noble grape varieties, from France that seem to get planted all over the world. Like, come on. There's Timorasso and Caricante and Piedroso and Pecorino. And I just had my first taste of Nascetta the other day, this sort of rare white wine from the Piemonte region. And so it's like, why would you just settle for Merlot 7 nights a week? Like, there's just so much more out there. And so when in my writing, in my own personal exploration, I really try to cultivate curiosity as sort of one of the chief virtues of a wine lover. And in my book about flavors and aromas that I wrote called The Essence of Wine, I have an essay about sort of the virtues of a wine lover, and curiosity is chief among them. And so for me, that's what's interesting about the world of wine, just its variety. And what has been happening over the last 10 years, which I'm incredibly excited about, is this resurgence of interest in all the native grape varieties, the autochthonous, to use the super fancy term, or indigenous, a word people are a little more familiar with, grape varieties in each of these regions where, sure, there's plenty of Merlot planted in Italy, but people are like, well, the world doesn't need another Merlot. I'm going to focus on this obscure, grape Raye that has been growing in this one little area of Piemonte for a while. And we're going to try and make that come back. Timorasso is a great example of that, right? Where, at one point it was down to like, I think a few rows of that grape variety. And it took a couple dedicated winemakers to come and say, look, we're not going to let this die out. And they took cuttings and they planted it. And now it's become this incredible success story of a white wine in the Piedmont region. So people all over the world are doing that. Countries are sort of recognizing and beginning to celebrate and realizing there's a market, especially internationally, for their native grape varieties. I mean, just look at Turkey, which planted its share of Cabernet and Chardonnay and Merlot, but now people are pushing Kalečik Karasu and Kuzguzu and all these grapes that are indigenous and native to the country of Turkey.
Oh, I was going to pronounce those. Oxide. Kuzguzu. That's
yes, they're also fun to say, in addition to fun to drink.
Yeah, right. I think you and I are maybe the only 2 people in America who know that. And the wines are spectacular, can be. Like anything else. I do want to make one comment just to jump in. I get asked that a lot. Oh, you're a wine guy. What's the best bottle of wine? And I'm reminded of a story a friend of mine once told me. He said he used to be a busboy at the Boca Raton Hotel and Country Club way back in the day when sommeliers were rare. And this very 8-foot tall Austrian guy named Hans, with the whole penguin suit and everything. And my friend asked him kind of sheepishly, Hans, what's the best bottle of wine? And Hans said, the one I just sold. So I take a relative commercial view on this. And I agree in terms of the autochthonous indigenous varietals. But from a commercial point of view, it's kind of hard to sell those things. I mean, we talked about Greek wines, Ayuritico and Xinomavro and some of those. Part of it is the pronunciation, but we learned how to say Sauvignon Blanc, which is kind of hard for us, right? And
look, if people can learn how to pronounce Daenerys Targaryen, right, from Game of Thrones, they can pronounce Fateasca Negra, or Ricazzatelli. Like, it ain't that hard.
Yeah, but I think for people who are really interested in wines, it's not that hard. For everybody else, there's this whole embarrassment factor. You don't want to be wrong. Like wine has been kind of put onto this pedestal of saying you either know everything about it or you know nothing. And people therefore are hesitant to try these things. And I think one of the biggest things I'm seeing in a lot of platforms, apps, tools is trying to democratize wine, and that your enjoyment is what you like, not what a critic says. We're kind of gotten beyond the point where the critics control the conversation.
Well, that's great. I mean, I'm all for people making their own decisions about wine. And I think it's one of the great cultural tragedies of our country. And I think this is quite specific to America, that people believe they need to know something about wine to enjoy it. And, Eric Asimov in the New York Times has written about this extensively, both in his memoir, How to Love Wine, and then just in his columns as well. It really is a tragedy that somehow wine became associated with the educated upper class of America. And now there's this fake, made up, but still very powerful barrier for a lot of people to enjoying wine as part of daily meal and daily life.
Well, and I think one of the contributors to that is the vocabulary that is used. There was a publication that basically created the concept of descriptors. And it has gotten to the point now, from my perspective, I don't know what a sautéed gooseberry tastes like, but those are some of the words that are being used. And people feel that if they're not familiar with those words or can't sense sautéed gooseberry, they're somehow not adequate.
I think that is a symptom, not a cause. Right? I mean, think about other areas of American cultural life that are rife with jargon. Baseball. It's completely Greek to me. There's incredible number of terms and things like that don't understand. I have no idea what they're talking about, but yet, 11-year-old boys across the country speak this different language, right? That doesn't keep me from going to a baseball game with some friends and enjoying myself and having a hot dog and a beer and watching the game. And I think the same is true of wine. Certainly there's a language about it. Certainly there's an incredible amount of, depth that you can get to in learning and knowing about it. But I think people's reticence to do that is not because of that language or that jargon. It's because of those deeper cultural issues, the cultural history of wine in America, rather than the domain or the language of wine itself. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to resolve it here, or maybe ever. So let's talk more about organic, sustainable, and biodynamic. I saw some research recently which talked about sustainable, the word sustainable, being more powerful and more resonant with consumers than the word organic, which does have it has a definition in the US, regulated by the USDA, probably misunderstood by old world and even new world wineries who want to come to the U.S. I'm organic in Europe. Why can't I be organic in the U.S.? And then, of course, there's the biodynamics. So you want to talk about those three words and what they mean and how you feel about them?
Yeah, well, they're all great words that I wish appeared on more wine bottles regularly. We are saddled with the unfortunate history of a really misdefined term when it comes to organic and the USDA and wine. It specifies a number of things about wine production, in particular the use of sulfur, to call a wine organic as opposed to a wine made from organic grapes, which are two different things. And that history of forcing producers to a particular sulfur use regimen, a very low sulfur use regimen, in order to get the organic certification, meant that in the early days of organic wine, most of them were utter crap. They tasted awful. Many of them were spoiled. And so organic wine, when it first hit the market, created an incredibly bad impression on consumers. And that impression has not gone away, unfortunately. And so there's nor have the regulations gone away, which are completely outdated and out of step with the rest of the world when it comes to what organic wine actually means. And so as a result, you will see very little organic wine in the United States. You will see plenty of wine, quote unquote, made with organic grapes, which is different. And so I think sustainable has become a way of sort of short-circuiting or stepping around that unfortunate past and history with organic wine. It's also a word that has gotten currency in plenty of other domains, right? Whether it be, sustainably harvested and farmed cotton for our t-shirts or coffee for our, espressos or other things. It's a word that consumers are used to seeing and starting to look for, as they establish their own personal ethical and moral stands about how they want to guide their shopping. And so sustainable has become certainly a buzzword in the world of wine. Unfortunately, it is a not particularly well defined one, or maybe a better way of saying that it is a word that has been defined in many different ways by many different people and groups. And so it's unfortunately not clear what you're going to get when you buy a bottle that someone on the back label has written, "We grow our grapes sustainably." That there's no way of guaranteeing exactly what that means. Whereas with biodynamic, that is a wholly different regimen that, especially if somebody is biodynamically certified through an organization like Demeter or some organization in Europe, you can be pretty sure of at least what is not done to that wine and to those grapes as they are grown in a way that you can't when a wine is called sustainable. Having said all that, however, I think all of them are great. Anybody that wants to farm organically, anybody that wants to make organic wine, anybody that wants to take steps towards sustainability, even if they might not be quite as sustainable as I think they are, anybody that wants to go biodynamic, I think all of that is really good for the planet. It's good for consumers and good for the wine industry.
One of my colleagues on this podcast is Monty Walden, who has written a couple of books on biodynamic wine. British, lives in Italy, and really passionate about that. And I have been ambivalent. You and I have had a couple of conversations over the years about this. But I was on one trip. We were for a short time importing a wine, Musella, from the Veneto area. And Maddalena Pasqua de Biscelli, if I pronounced that correctly, took me out to her vineyard, and she said, "Here, just dig into the soil with your hand." And I was able to put my hand in like up to the wrist. And she said, "That's what biodynamic is." So I had nothing, it wasn't all about the cow horns and the preparations and all that kind of stuff. The net was clearly a palpable, a tactile difference in the soil that the vines are growing in. And now I can make that connection that was more academic before and maybe mystical.
Absolutely. I think one of the great frontiers of human knowledge to be discovered is an understanding of the microbiome in all of its different forms and incarnations. And I think that's true, within our own bodies, the microbiome of our guts, and how that affects and relates to the rest of our constitution and health as human beings. And increasingly, it's looking like the microbiome of the soil plays an incredibly crucial role in the health, the flavor, the taste, the performance, the everything to do with everything that we grow in the soil, but in particular with grapes. And so I think as research continues, we are going to start to learn some of the things that I think biodynamics doesn't explain correctly, but biodynamics does get right in its emphasis on building, a self-contained ecosystem that really supports the health of that soil and its microbiome.
Well, speaking about soils and microbiomes, you had said when we were talking earlier about your interest in volcanic wines. And let's turn our attention now to Italian volcanic wines. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the category and what you see happening and what's of interest.
I don't know what it is. I mean, John Szabo, Master Sommelier, wrote a whole book on this, which I think is brilliant. I don't think I've ever been as jealous of a fellow writer as I have when he came out with that book, because, that's a book I would have loved to have written at some point someday, but he had the idea first and he knows more about it, way more than I do. So it's a book that I treasure and refer to frequently, because I am drawn to volcanic based wines. John identifies several characteristics that he says are sort of endemic to volcanic wines: grit, saltiness, and power. And while I might not always use those words or always think that those are exactly correct, there is something different about volcanic wines. And the salt in particular is a word that I respond to, because there's a salinity that you can get sometimes with volcanic wines that is just really compelling and a really interesting dimension to the wines. And I tend to be kind of an acid freak when it comes to wines. I like wines with high acidity and wines that sort of drive the the salivary glands, nuts, mouth-watering wine. More often than not, volcanic wines do that for me. They just have this incredible mouth-watering quality where, you don't want to just take a sip, you want to take a gulp. You don't want to just take a gulp, you want to drink a glass. And you don't want to just drink a glass, you want to drink a half a bottle. And so I find them amazingly compelling. I also find the sort of primal nature of the struggle of the grapevine in the volcanic sort of terroir to be compelling. I mean, you and I were on Santorini, right? And you remember sort of seeing, those soils, 6, 12, 20 feet of ash, and tufa, and these, scraggly vines, sort of digging their roots down into the soil, hugging the ground tightly so that the winds don't blow them over. And that's really compelling. Like, that's not the nicely manicured, green flat lawns of Bordeaux. It's just a fundamentally different landscape, and it's hard not to. And I think this is the human condition speaking here, not the reality, but it's hard not to see those vines on volcanic soils, in the pits, on the Canary Islands or high on the slopes of Mount Etna, the world's, a huge active volcano, and think, wow, these vines are really working a lot harder than those ones that are sort of lazing around on the lawns of Bordeaux. And maybe something about that working harder comes through, in the wines.
So when we're talking about volcanic wines, what of the Italian varietal volcanic wines have you been most interested in lately?
Well, I left my heart on Etna, so I'm just a massive fan of Norella Mascalese and Norello Cappuccio and Caricante and all those grapes and the wines that are made on the slopes of Mount Etna. I also really appreciate a really well made Soave, and the volcanic wines from that region of the Veneto. There's some primary, granitic rock in Sardinia that also produces some pretty amazing wines. And then there's some little oddball ones. You brought up Zabibbo, and Pantelleria the other day when we were talking, and so there's some great ones there as well.
Okay, well, we're coming to the end. It's a very interesting interview of Alder Yarrow, author of Vinography. I like to end the conversations with asking my guests what the big takeaway is of this. Is there something that someone listening to this show can take away and put to use some practical way immediately?
I hope this conversation was at the very least entertaining, and if I think back on my role as a wine communicator, part of what I want to do is to get people excited about wine. And so, I would hope that people would sort of hang on to that notion of curiosity that I think is so important for anybody in every stage of their wine enjoyment and journey to and with wine in their lives. And so, push yourselves a little bit to be more curious, to try new things, to explore more of the world of wine, because, it's impossible for that to be unfulfilling. It's impossible for that not to, increase your enjoyment of what wine has to offer.
Cool. Well, as I think about it, I asked the question, I'll answer it myself too. The concept of keep on tasting. Just because those are the only wines that are sold in the store doesn't mean that those are the only wines that are out there. So as your journey, as you learn or engage with wine, there is no beginning. I guess there's a beginning, but there really isn't an end until you're dead, because there's always going to be something new to enjoy. So anytime you have an opportunity to go to a tasting, and if it's from a country you might not have thought of, whether it's Romania or Bulgaria or Bolivia for that matter, to all, take it. It's like what Yogi used to say, right? When you come to a fork in the road, take it. Whenever you get a chance to taste wine, taste it. Anyway, sorry to jump in on that. So we're going to wrap up this week's edition. I want a special thank you to Alder. You've been a good friend over the years, and I've been pleased and proud to be able to say that of you. And I look forward to reading and enjoying your opinions in the ensuing few years. So this is Steve Raye saying thank you to Alder.
Thank you.
And to all of my listeners, we'll see you next week on Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People. So chin chin and ciao ciao. Thank you again, Alder.
That was fun.
This is Steve Raye saying thanks again for listening on behalf of the Italian Wine Podcast.